So this video is actually an old one that I took down because I did something potentially wrong in it. I might have gotten away with it, but I'm not going to know that until this project is a little further along. So what I potentially did wrong is I watched some videos of people installing polyurethane bushings, and that kind of made me blind to the fact that I had instructions right in front of my face. So I didn't read the instructions at all, really. And I just went ahead and was like, well, I need to remove the bushings. So that's what I started doing. And those bushings have three parts. There's the inner metal sleeve, the rubber on the outside of that, and then a outer metal sleeve on the outside of the rubber. And I went and removed all three of those pieces on every bushing through this car. So whatever, it has two in the front for those control arms, and then each rear has two sides for the rear control arms. And the issue is that I put this car together, didn't notice anything wrong, but my dad and I went to go do the same thing to one of the 300Zs, and thankfully I'd only done one of them, but I removed one bushing completely, and I went to put the polyurethane bushing into the control arm just for giggles, and it was loose. It actively just would fall out of the control arm, which was obviously very wrong. Then I decided to read the instructions, and in the instructions for those bushings, you're not supposed to remove that outer part of the bushing. You're supposed to press the polyurethane into it. So ended up having to buy like a $78 factory Nissan control arm bushing for that Z. It came out of like the UAE or the something like that, something crazy like that. But anyways, it made me worried about this one. So that's whenever I took both the video of redoing the front end, as well as the video of redoing the back end down. So since then, I had taken one of these control arms loose, and I couldn't pull the bushing out by hand. Also, when I put all the bushings in this car, I didn't notice anything wrong, like how it was immediately obvious with the 300. And I was reading some forum posts, and apparently there are two different ways that these bushings have been done, either where you remove the entire bushing and the polyurethane rides on the control arm, or you remove just the inner part of the bushing and the polyurethane rides on the outer part of the original bushing. And some people were saying that it kind of went either ways and the instructions didn't totally line up with it. So maybe there's a chance I lucked out here, because this, past me didn't notice any problems with this when I put it together. So maybe it'll be fine, but that was why I took the original video down, because I didn't want to potentially mislead somebody even if I got away with it. So the rest of this video is just the same footage as the old video. I just took out any reference of cutting up the outer portion of the bushings. So that's pretty much that. Okay, so I got all of this tore out of the car. It took less than an hour to get it all out. It really was not that big of a deal. And so while I had it out, I popped the cover off the diff just to see what was going on in here. And so I was just looking it over and didn't see any issues with it. The backlash on the pinion. So that's all the slop, between the pinion and the ring gear, and then the the diff, the actual spider gears. But it's just barely anything. It has these nasty marks in it, which I'm assuming are from the pinion hitting the carrier, because the diff I took out of the 68 had the same deal going on. You can see it's not great. But what I don't understand is I put a piece of painter's tape over this, just loosely placed it on there where it's not pushed down into any of these grooves. Just loosely placed over it and spun it around, spinning the axle, spinning the pinion. And that tape never touched anything. It never touched the pinion. So I'm not quite sure what is up with that, or why those marks are there, or if this thing had a problem in the past and was rebuilt or something. I would find that kind of difficult to believe, but I guess it's possible. Okay, so I got the cover back on the diff. All the gears and everything looked fine in it. I didn't see any pitting or signs that there had ever been moisture in it, and Nothing, no weird wear patterns or anything. There was a fair bit of metal that came out of the oil, or that was in the oil that came out of it, but I'm not too concerned about it just because this thing didn't have a whole lot of oil in it to begin with. So I have no doubt it's got wear in it. But, I mean, at this point in time, I really don't want to tear it apart and then rebuild it. So if it decides it's going to have a problem, then we'll save that for another day. But, so, things to be aware of when you buy a used car is some of the shady stuff you'll find. So here is a lug nut that's supposed to be on this car. So it's got a flat washer on the top of it. So that's what holds the rim on. And then it has this, I think the shank is the technical term for it. And that's what actually, you know, the rim rides on. Well, on this side, somebody just threw on just some regular acorn style lug nuts, which is bad for a number of reasons. One, it's going to tear the rim up because the rim doesn't have this tapered surface. Two, it's bad because the lug nut isn't going to thread all the way in, so it's not going to be grabbing as much thread. Three, I would say, oh yeah, so being tapered here, the rim is only touching the lug nut and I guess effectively being attached to the stud, just out here on the very, very edge. So the weight of the car, the torque from accelerating and stopping, rather than acting along this whole area like on the other one, it's acting, you know, just right there, which is not good because that's harder on the rim and it's also harder on the stud because all that force is acting way out here instead of being distributed all the way across here. And then so this whole setup here is how you adjust the wheel this way. And so as you rotate the bolt, it rotates in this off-centered washer. And so before I took it apart, I marked it. So I'm just putting it back the way it was, since the way it was is probably better than me just guessing. The procedure for getting these old bushings out seems to be just put the torch on the side of it until it lights itself on fire, and then when it starts like spewing the rubber out of it, and then you can hit the metal part out and it just falls out like that one. All right, for this method to work, it seems like you gotta have it kind of sitting vertical so that the flames, you know, it travels up the bushing and burns it all out. Because I had it laying horizontal and it definitely didn't work. So we're trying this again here, and there's a lot more progress as it's, you know, pushing it out the top. All right, so I'm getting ready to put this back in. I already have all the new bushings in it, which was a really simple deal. There really wasn't anything to it. It's just put the rubber in, put the sleeve in it. I used a lot of the grease on it, and this was the kit I got. And I really liked it because everything, all the individual parts were, or not the individual parts groups were all individually boxed, like tie rod end boots. And so everything came in boxes. The ones that needed instructions had instructions. They all, most of them have their own individual thing of grease. So that was good. I got everything greased up good with the right grease. For the sway bar, I just kind of measured from the top of the nut to the top of the bolt, just kind of counted the threads and got it as even as I could, side to side. But yeah, so it was a real simple deal, and then I cleaned it all and just painted it a flat black, top and bottom, and make it look decent. I mean, it's filthy now because it's all covered in dust from sanding the car, but it's a lot better than it was. Okay, so I've been using several wire wheel attachments on a grinder to work on this thing. And my opinion after having done that is don't use these. These are not worth using because in my opinion, a grinder has too much power to it to safely use one of these. If you're using a drill, that's fine, that's not that big of a deal, and a drill has you holding your hands in a different place. So on 2 different occasions today, one time it got caught on a hole, and one time it got caught on the end of the metal that I was working on. And even with, being real careful about it, just trying to sneak up on it, as soon as this thing catches on something, it's out of your control. It doesn't matter if you're tensed up ready for it. As soon as it grabs something, it's going somewhere. And if I wouldn't have had gloves on, that was the first one, that was the second one. If I didn't have this glove on, I would have messed up my hand today, twice. Also to add to that is don't use one of these cheap ones. I just bought all of these in one really cheap kit. This thing works, but it throws bristles off of it constantly. You're constantly getting stung as the bristles come flying off of this. So I wouldn't buy cheap ones of those. And just to clarify what I was using these for. So if you're using this on a flat surface and going around, that's not an issue. Where it was an issue for me working under the car is when you're going along, and you're hitting something like this, and then all of a sudden there's nothing, and then it rips it out of your hand. Or if you're going along and you hit something like this, and it rips it out of your hand and gets all crazy. So if you use this, I don't have a problem with using on a flat surface, but I've been trying to use these to strip the underside of the car and clean all the little areas of the subframe, and they are not good for that. But yeah, I don't even know how many hours of stripping the underside of this car. I'm gonna be putting, bearings and brushes in my grinder by the time this is all said and done. But it was a worthwhile effort, just because, that area over there had a bunch of rust. And I've hit all this with the rust converter, so it should be fine now. But all these dark spots, right there in the center of the frame, and that right there. Again, I hit it with the rust converter, so it should all be fine. But all of those areas like that were rust that was covered up by the undercoat, and there was no indication that there was any rust going on under the undercoat. It's the same paint as what I used up at the front. It's just PR15, and I used the gloss one just because that's what they had. I had doubts about whether or not it would look good, but I really am kind of pleased with how it's turning out. And then after that dries, I'm gonna put seam sealer over it because I want the paint to adhere straight to the metal, and then I'll put the seam sealer over the top of that just as an extra precaution. And if I have a whole bunch of paint left over, then I'll put a second coat on top of that just to hopefully guarantee that none of this nonsense has to happen again. All right, here's the finished product. So it's all painted and clean. I had to go over these wires with some new insulation, and then this one I actually had to put a piece of heat shrink around because I accidentally got into it with the wire wheel. But yeah, everything's sealed up. So it's 2 coats. I did 1 coat and then went over all the seams and welds with seam sealer. And then I put another coat on top of that. I got all up in this area, all around anything that's overlapped, all up in the shock towers. So, at the very least, it's better than it was. Well, this paintbrush was trashed whenever I started. It's certainly trashed now. I forgot to clean it off whenever I was done. But I just thought this was interesting. Hammer. doesn't even touch it. So, engineering me thought this was really interesting. This is one of the 2 bolts that holds the front mounts for the whole rear subframe to the car. And yeah, so consistent diameter, and then it steps up, flattens back out, goes into this tapered bit, flattens out a little bit, steps up to this real big size, tapers back down, flattens out, tapers down again to this much smaller diameter. But, I mean, look at how much machine work it would take to reproduce that. I mean, I don't know why so much thought was put into this, but, man, somebody put a considerable amount of effort into designing this stud to do exactly what it's doing. Okay, so I'm replacing all the fuel line and stuff while this is apart, and I'm dealing with a lot of these factory clamps, and they're a huge pain to reuse, but the trick seems to be to grab it in a pair of pliers like that so that it can't come apart, lay it down, and then tap around on the top of it to open it back up, and then you can get a new hose through pretty easy. Okay, so the sending unit's back in the car. Lesson learned with that is first 2 of the original bolts I put in, both of them snapped off. It was kind of like, you know, oh, the bolt's not very tight, the bolt's not very tight, still kind of loose. Why'd it loosen up? Snap. So I went ahead and just got rid of all of them and went and grabbed some M4-.7 by 10 bolts, because they're metric, obviously, and got washers and lock washers to go with them, and that seemed to work out pretty good. And if you notice, there is one that does not match. That is just a coarse thread screw, because one of the broke bolts I was able to get out with an easy out. The other one I could not get out. And I had a hole drilled in the snapped off portion of the bolt that the easy out wouldn't grab, but a screw threaded into that hole pretty good. So that's what's in there now. I mean, it's tight. After I welded up the gas tank, you can't even really tell it was ever messed up there. But yeah, so underside of the car is all buttoned up. I ran all new fuel line for everything. Got all new brackets. I just decided to keep this pulse thing for the fuel pump just because, I don't know, maybe it'll help. And then as far as the fuel pump goes, so this is a new fuel pump, at least according to the previous owner, so that could mean pretty much anything. But the specs I could find on this AutoBest, yeah, that's a hilarious name, isn't it? Fuel pump is that at the pressure of the fuel injection system for this car, this pump theoretically, from the charts I was finding, should be able to support the small block that will be in this car. So if that's true, then running the 6 or 7 PSI for the carburetor, it ought to be flowing even more. And so, I don't know, we'll just see if it works out. Hopefully it will. If it doesn't, I have another inline fuel pump from this that I pulled off the 68 that I had on it originally. And I think that fuel pump would actually be a direct bolt in here. And that one I know would be able to support the motor. And as far as things not painted, I haven't put the filler neck in yet because I just figured it would be better to put that in after the car was painted, so I'm just gonna tape that off so nothing gets in there. The access panel lets you get to all the lines for the sending unit, which you can get the sending unit in through that hole. It's kind of difficult to, and you gotta be careful with it, but I was able to get it in there without having to drop the tank because I put the tank up without the sending unit, thinking the sending unit would just drop through the hole, but it's a tight fit to get the sending unit in through the hole in the floor and into the tank. But anyway, so there's this line here, that's your evap system, and I think I'm gonna keep this if it doesn't cause any problems or any added complexity, just for the sake of it doing something with the gas vapor. Because one thing I don't really like is every now and then when I'm in the 68, which it's an old truck thing, so I really don't care. But I don't want that to be on this car where this thing's constantly pushing out gas vapor and you can smell it as you drive. And so I left a lot of slack in this line because the other end of this line you can't get to unless you drop the tank down. So I left plenty of line to be able to drop the tank down where I can then get to it. I guess you could undo it up here and snake it through, but I thought it was easier just to leave some slack. And then as far as things not painted, I don't have new shocks yet, so I put these in here so I can set it back on its wheels. But the struts will get painted whenever I have the new shocks and everything. And then I didn't repaint the axles either because I rebuilt them. I didn't really rebuild them. I took them apart and cleaned them and greased them. And the reason I did that was that, to my knowledge, from a few hours looking around online, it's my understanding that not a single company makes reproduction axles for this car. That sounds absolutely insane, but that apparently is the fact of the matter, is that no company makes this axle. Either axle. I think they're the same side to side, but nobody makes axles for a 280ZX with a manual transmission. In fact, that might even apply to an automatic, because I don't know, for whatever reason, Nissan just does not believe in the idea of interchangeable parts. So this axle only applies to a 280ZX, which I don't know about 260s or 240s or anything like that. But just talking about 280ZX models, this axle only applies to this car which had a manual and was a non-turbo. Because if you have a manual, you get an R200 diff, which is the good diff, it's the diff you want. And if you have an automatic, you get an R180 diff. Why not just put the same diff in all the cars? I have no idea. But so if you have an automatic, you have a different diff, you have different axles. If you have a manual, you have a different diff and you have different axles. And if you have a turbo, regardless of whatever transmission it has, you have an R200 diff, but you have different axles. And the turbo axles are the CV axles that you can find for sale everywhere. But everything I was reading and just briefly looking at them, they are never going to bolt into the car because that flange right there is not the same as for a turbo car. So it's like, oh, well, yeah, you just need to find one of those from a turbo. Yeah, nobody makes them as far as I can tell. So you're kind of screwed. So with that in mind of not being able to find axles for this thing, I took it apart. That's why I took it apart and re-greased it and tried to make sure that, hopefully it'll survive. But anyways, that rant aside, the axles are the only thing that aren't going to get painted, that could have been painted, just because they're all filthy, greasy, and I didn't really see any way that I would ever be able to get them clean enough that paint would stick. So I figured it'd be better to just leave them. But yeah, so there's that. Underside of the cars all together. I'm gonna order those shocks for it and then tear the front apart and rebuild it.